Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at New Covenant House. We are, as you know, reading Christian Anarchism by Alexander Christoyanopoulos, who wrote it as his doctoral thesis. And we are in chapter 3, and we're going to start a new little series here today about how church doctrine is in support of the state. So the first session here will be about the Sermon on the Mount, how the church misinterprets the Sermon on the Mount to support the state, and the second next week will be about how the church misinterprets the command not to resist evil, which is actually also part of the Sermon on the Mount, but it's so central for Christian anarchists that it has its own little chapter here. And then the third week, we're going to talk about the support for political authority. So that's a little overview of what we're going to be doing for the next 3 or 4 weeks. So when we were at the beginning of this book study, we talked about this Sermon on the Mount was kind of like regarded as a manifesto for Christian anarchism. So everything about Christian anarchism is in the Sermon on the Mount, basically. And the conclusion is that we're not trying to combine Christianity and anarchism. Anarchism is simply inherent in Christianity. So if you are a Christian, you're automatically also an anarchist. If you follow the teachings of Christ, which a lot of people apparently don't. So at the beginning we also said that some people make honest mistakes. They misinterpret the text to say something that it actually doesn't. And then there are the more deliberate misinterpretations of the text to serve somebody's purpose. And that's the kind of misinterpretation we're going to be talking about tonight. And there are going to be 4 or 5 things we're going to touch upon. The first one is about swearing oaths. The second is about not to be angry. And the third one is love your enemies. Then not judging. And finally, commit adultery. The last one, only Tolstoy talks about that. The other anarchist writers don't really care about that one too much. Yep, so let's get into it. So the first person to really deliberately misinterpret the gospel is Augustine, because he was commissioned by Constantine to kind of reshape Christianity to support his military campaigns. So he is the one who's getting the first attack here, and that's about swearing oaths. What Augustine is saying about swearing oaths is that he says a good use of an oath is not evil because it is necessary in order to persuade. So Tolstoy then comes around and says, that's not good. They are, as the swearing of oaths are all dishonest and incompatible with Jesus' simple instruction. You will know that Jesus' instruction is to not swear at all. And then he goes on to say that so-called Christian teachers have boldly forced men to take oaths on the gospel itself. So when you are in court, you swear with your hand on the Bible, which specifically tells you not to do that. So that's a little bit of an irony there. And then the second misinterpretation, deliberate misinterpretation that the church does, is the command not to be angry. The conformist theologians, those are the ones that try to blend the church into the state, say that they have argued somehow only to the motivation behind the act, not the act itself. So it is okay to be angry as the motivation, but not the act itself. Tolstoy says about that, is founded on the words "without a cause," forbidding anger without a cause. And what he says about that is that the phrase "without a cause" has been inserted into some Bible translations. It was not in the original Greek. And that is simply a deception that is unacceptable. And by inserting that little sentence "without a cause," it destroys the whole meaning of the verse, he says. Orthodox interpretations downplayed or even revised Jesus' original meaning based on a clause which appears to have been disingenuously inserted into the original text. Okay, so that was about not to be angry. And then the third one is love your enemies. And that is, we're going to go back to Augustine again here, because his job was to justify Constantine's wars. And he did that with a couple of other guys. He wrote the eight justifications for war. And we went over those when we studied Plan B, the Plan B book. And we can go back to that if anybody is interested in doing that. So what Augustine says is that was to interpret it in a way that did not contradict the articulation of this doctrine of just war. So here again he argued, as Johnston explains, that it refers to an inner disposition and not outward action, which leads to the conclusion that it is fine to murder people as long as proper inner attitude of love is maintained. And what Tolstoy says about that is that the words of Jesus are generally corrected to mean that though we cannot love our enemies because it is too difficult, we may refrain from wishing them or doing them any ill. So Christian anarchists, of course, either of these methods are betraying the original commandment by attempting to justify its opposite. And anyway, early Christians would have never contemplated murder as compatible in any way with their ethos. So I think that's pretty clear that it was never the intention of Jesus that people should murder anybody, not even in a war. And then the final one we're going to talk about here is not the commandment not to judge. The conventional theologians limits that to verbal slander, but that's not enough, says Tolstoy, because the Greek literally means passing a sentence. It has nothing to do with emotion, or if you like somebody or not. So he says that it is a conventional sense of passing a sentence on or to condemn to punishment. Based on this analysis, Tolstoy deduces that the translation into evil speaking or slander is the most fanciful and unauthorized of all. Okay? So that is another example of how conventional theologians are misinterpreting the gospel. And then there's finally the command not to commit adultery. We're not going to talk too much about that because Tolstoy is the only one who really gets into that. Its usual interpretation is nonetheless for Tolstoy yet another example of an intentional corruption of the text, which destroys the moral, the religious, the grammatical, and the logical meaning of the words of Jesus. So that's were like 5 or 6 places where the church have misinterpreted the gospel. And next time we're going to get into the one commandment not to resist evil, and that's a kind of a lengthy passage, so we may have to do it in 2 weeks, but we'll see. Thank you all for coming, and if you are here, you can stay for the discussion, but now we're going to turn off the recording, and it will be available on the Facebook group shortly.